Dr. Linda Birnbaum, Ph.D., DBT, ATS, is the former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, of the National Institutes of Health, and the National Toxicology Program. After retirement, she was granted Scientist Emeritus status and still maintains a laboratory. As a board-certified toxicologist, Dr. Birnbaum served as a federal scientist for 40 years. Prior to her appointment as NIEHS and NTP director in 2009, she spent 19 years at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she directed the largest division focusing on environmental health research. This presentation was given as a part of ChristianaCare's internal medicine grand rounds.
To go and hello to everyone, and I really look forward to this opportunity to talk a little bit about what I call the perils of PFAS. Sometimes I talk about these chemicals that are everywhere, everything, all of us. And I'll kind of give you the overview of why that's true. And I look forward to some time for questions towards the end. So we go to the next slide. I just did want to, next slide, please, Kate. Just let you know that I have worked as a plaintiff's expert on a large PFAS case, which has been settled, that one anyway. So that was kind of fun. That was obviously after I retired, because as a federal, let's just say as a federal employee, there were lots of ethical restrictions. Can I have the next slide, please? So really the first things is to define what are PFAS. And the definition, different groups may use different definitions, but 22 states and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and many other groups use a definition that says PFAS contain at least one fully fluorinated methyl or methylene carbon. And the total number of PFAS are at least 15,000. I heard at a meeting yesterday that there are from 1,500 and 235 actually identified. But some people say there are actually millions of these chemicals, and they include many products as well as impurities and degradants. So if you've ever heard of Teflon or Scotchgard or aqueous film forming foam, these products all contain or have contained PFAS. Why do we have so many PFAS? Because of their resistance to grease, water, and oil. They function as surfactants and stain repellents, and I mentioned the AFFF, and that's been used for fire suppression. I'll make the comment before I forget to mention it, that all the major Europes in Europe have not been using PFAS containing AFFF for at least 10 years. And in fact, we really, I would argue that we don't need it. So what are the problems with these chemicals? Well, they are all of them environmentally persistent. Nobody's ever been able to measure half-life in the environment for this class of chemicals. They are extremely mobile, and many of them accumulate in our bodies. So we have the short chain alternatives to what we call the legacy, which are the ones that I'll spend a little more time on, the PFOA and the PFOS, and they've just been well studied. And when we start studying them, guess what? We find the same thing. And I want to point out what we call the ultra short chains, which are like the C1, the C2, or the C3. So the C2 is trifluoroacetic acid. This one has been shown to have reproductive effects, at least in experimental animal model systems. And this one is a huge contaminant that we know almost nothing about. So if we take the class of intentionally made PFAS, they kind of break down into two groups, polymers and non-polymers. And you may hear that polymers are not a problem because polymers won't be absorbed into our bodies. That's largely true, although certainly when polymers are used to make plastics and those plastics break down. There was an article just yesterday or today about actually finding microplastics containing fluorinated polymers in, for example, lipid plaques in our arteries. But the problem with polymers is you got to make them, and then there's a life cycle, and eventually they break down, and at different phases of the life cycle can release short chains or smaller PFAS. The non-polymers are two basic groups, the perfluoroalkyl, which are just chains of carbon atoms with loads of fluorine stuck on them, and they can have different end groups. And then you have the polyfluorosubstances, where you may have some carbons and then an oxygen, or another molecule and then more carbons, but again, loads of fluorine on the carbons. So if we go to the next slide, I think it's important to realize that new PFAS are found all the time. So this is now 5 years ago, but when all of a sudden this was reported in New Jersey and it was shown to be due to the production from a chemical company called Solvay. And guess what? Now these PFAS not only had carbon and fluorine and oxygen, so they were polyfluoroalkyl substance, they also had a chlorine group stuck on them. And we're finding more and more of these chemicals again whenever you look. Next slide, please. So where do we find the PFAS? Well, the PFAS are, as I said, kind of everywhere and in everything. They're present in carpet and fabric and food packaging and food, and we'll talk a little more about the food because it's not only from the food packaging, it can actually pick it up from the soil or from the air. Present in nonstick pots and pans, present in lots of our clothing. If you have something that is either water repellent or water resistant or stain resistant, lots of cardboard packaging has it. Again, the film forming foam, and then it's cosmetics as well. And if you look actually at the graph kind of in the upper corner, what you can see is that electronics are a big part of the use of these products. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a little diagram showing you all the consumer products or some of the, that makes it easy to remember your furniture and your fast food packaging, for example. I think cosmetics especially don't ever buy water-resistant mascara because, for example, they're loaded with PFAS. Next slide, please. So how are we being exposed to this class of chemicals? Well, I think the main thing is there are no naturally occurring PFAS. They are products of industrial use. Some of the products have been very useful. So you get exposure through consumer goods, through firefighting foams that have been used both by the military and whenever there's a fire and at airports, and your local fire departments used to carry them in their trucks. This gets into the environment, into the waste infrastructure, or just directly into the environment. And from the environment, this can lead to human exposure directly, or it can lead to exposure of our food. And we now know that these compounds are not only present, you've probably heard about, and much of the concern has been driven by the contamination of drinking water, but it's not only drinking water. In fact, in most cases, food is our major source of exposure. Dust is also a source of exposure, and you can not only ingest this stuff, but you can inhale it. Many of the PFAS can be present in a volatile form. And while dermal absorption is not a major route of exposure, except maybe for firefighters who have it in their gear, it can be a source of exposure. So, as I said, these PFAS are incredibly persistent. They do not degrade. At least the carbon-fluorine bonds do not degrade. Some of the bigger PFAS may break down to give you some smaller PFAS. And one of the big problems we're having is these PFAS all pass through standard water treatment plants. Next slide, please. So this is just a very recent diagram. This is the Environmental Working Group puts this out, and you can actually Google this and find out and put in your zip code and find out what the situation is in your local municipal water supply. I think that it's important to see that wherever basically you have large populations, you have problems with PFAS. And the other thing is where you have, for example, former airports or military bases. But you can see I come from North Carolina, and in my state, it's pretty contaminated in part because there is one of the largest plants that makes PFAS present in North Carolina. If we go to the next slide, this just picks up where PFAS are in your drinking water. Again, and I said these are EWG graphics that they make readily available, but all this data is coming from EPA's uncontaminated monitoring rule data, which is being generated by looking at essentially all the municipal water systems throughout the United States. And that's a process that's taking from 2023 to should be finished by the end of next year. And so if you can see this, you can see that around Wilmington, you've got lots of contamination. And of course, Delaware's a small state. You don't have to go far into Philadelphia or New Jersey before you also see a lot of contamination. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that PFAS is coming in our food, not only from food packaging, but also from the food that we eat. If you happen to be near a PFAS production or use site in industry, you likely have elevated levels in your air, which can get on your produce. But I think one of the most concerning things that I've been made aware of is how high the levels are of PFAS in U.S. freshwater fish. And essentially, EPA again does a monitoring program. Every 10 years, they sample over 500 composites of fish from a given region. And when the fish data was analyzed that was taken 10 years ago, this is what came out. And of the 500 samples, over 495 had levels of PFAS that exceeded the recommended level of PFAS that you should be eating. And I just heard in my neighborhood, and I just heard this yesterday at a meeting, that in our one of the major reservoirs for our municipal water system, the fish are exceeding the levels of contamination by hundreds of times. Pretty concerning. And I don't think I have a slide. I don't remember putting one in, but I should say marine fish and seafood is also contaminated, but you have different profiles of which PFAS are in the marine fish than are in the freshwater fish. So as I said, there are loads of different PFAS, but there are some different ones in our marine environment than we see in the freshwater fish. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the skin is a route of exposure, and this is a problem in so many firefighting organizations are switching to either PFAS-free firefighting gear or gear that has PFAS in only one layer of the gear. And I think that that's a point. And I see one question, and I'm going to talk about at the end about how we might be able to avoid PFAS. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that inhalation could be important. This is some data from California. And whether you looked in the air of kindergartens or, for example, a clothing store, what you could see that sometimes you have very high levels of certain PFAS in the air. So some of the PFAS you may have heard about, the PFOA and the PFOS, these are what we call the C8s. These are not volatile, but there are lots of things that break down to give you PFOA and PFOS, and they are extremely volatile. Next slide, please. So the thing is that we all have PFAS in our bodies. I think it's important to realize excuse me, oops, did I make that small? No. I'm trying not to see all the questions because it's distracting for me right now. But anyhow, more than 98% of people in the US have measurable amounts of PFAS. That's from the NHANES, which is the biannual survey that is done, a statistically based survey of the American populations. And what's good to know is I've mentioned PFOA and PFOS. These are PFAS that have 8 carbons in a row, one with a carboxylic acid, one with sulfonic acid at the end. And those levels are going down since they were removed, intentional use of them and production of them in the US stopped. PFOS, 3M was the sole US producer, and they stopped making this in 2002. PFOA was made by about 6 producers, and they stopped making this by 2013. But then you have all the other PFAS, and here are an example of 2 of them, PFDA, which is a C10, and PFHXS, which is a C6, and these levels have not changed. And if you go to the next slide, what you can see is that if you look at what's happening in breast milk, PFOS and PFOA are going down, and I think it's important to realize that breast milk is one route of excretion of these chemicals for people. But if you look at some of the new PFAS, some of the short chain PFAS we call, with only 4 to 7 carbons, in this case, what you can see is that the levels in breast milk are increasing in the United States. And I think that that is of concern. So we stopped making PFOS and PFOA, and now we're making these others, and the levels are going up in our bodies. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a huge composite of the health concerns that really began in the 60s. Now, most of us didn't know that because, in fact, these concerns were not reported in the literature or by industry. But as early as in the 1960s, there were reports that have been found by litigation in DuPont files from people at DuPont concerned about the health risks of PFAS. By 1980, there was evidence in a factory in West Virginia that there were some birth defects being found in women who were on the Teflon line. And it turned out that DuPont then wouldn't allow women to work on that line anymore, but they never talked about the issue of birth defects. And I should mention that some of the birth defects that were found at that point in time had been seen in experimental animals as well. And by the 1980s or the early 80s, there was evidence, for example, that some of these PFAS were deadly to monkeys, that they totally suppressed the immune system, that they caused liver damage, and so on. By the late 80s, it was clear that PFOA caused cancer in experimental animals. And what's really concerning to me is that actually, as early as 1975, 3M knew that PFOA and PFOS were present in the blood of the general population, not only their workers. And so in the last 25 years, there's been a great deal of work. 3M told EPA in 1998 that they were finding blood in the general population, and that led to, I was at EPA at that point in time, and lots of research started at that point to look at what we could find out about the adverse effects of PFOA and PFOS. As I said, PFOS is no longer made, so instead industry makes PFH excess, that's C6 I showed you is increasing in blood. We're also finding it increasing in breast milk. There were also findings of C4, PFBS that's being used, and the same thing with PFOA. One of the substitutes for PFOA is something called Gen X, which again was produced in 2 places in the US. DuPont spun off a company called Chemours. One of its facilities is in North Carolina, not too far from me. The other is in West Virginia. And in that case, they made something called Gen X, as well as many other things. And in fact, Gen X causes tumors in laboratory animals as well. There was a huge lawsuit. Some of it is still ongoing. It's often called the C8 study, but where DuPont settled a class action suit against people living relatively close and drinking water contaminated by the plant in West Virginia. And in this case, this has led to our understanding of many of the health effects in that population. If I could have the next slide. So I think what we have to understand is that PFAS don't do one thing. They're multi-system toxicant that affect a range of different tissues. And there are a couple on this very nice graphic, but I could tell you, I'm not sure I know of an organ system or a tissue system that PFAS has not been shown to impact either in experimental different animal models, or we have epidemiology studies showing associations in people. So some of the clearest ones, or I'll mention the ones that came out of the C8 study. The C8 study found an increased risk of kidney and testicular cancer, an increase in thyroid effects, problems in liver function and elevated cholesterol, and problems in reproduction with decreased fertility and hypertension during pregnancy, among things. In addition, there are clearly impacts on the immune system. Well, the C8 also found an increase in ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune condition, but in addition, there's lots of data now showing suppression of the immune system as well. There is evidence for impacts on the pancreas and increased risk of type 2 diabetes. I would say where we have some of the weakest evidence or the weakest information to date is on neurodevelopment, but that's increasing. I mentioned kidney and testicular cancer, and I'm going to show you some recent data showing increase in thyroid cancer as well. And I didn't put in a slide, but there's two very strong recent observational studies, one from Finland and one Finland with the National Cancer Institute, and another one from the University of California, Berkeley, showing increases in acute lymphocytic leukemia in children in association with their mother's exposure to PFAS in utero. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to pull up some recent data, which I think is important, stuff that some of this has just come out. There was stuff showing that in older people, they had elevated PFAS was associated with more weight gain. And now this study just came out looking in teenagers, showing that when teenagers have bariatric surgery to reduce weight, that they tend to put on more weight after the surgery in relationship to their amounts of PFAS. Can I have the next slide? And there's lots of studies showing PFAS impacting metabolism, but the sister study, if this is one you haven't heard of, I'll have to say it's a great one that we were running. We started recruiting people and women who were sisters of breast cancer patients. They themselves did not have breast cancer, but we recruited over 50,000 women from across the United States and are following them to this day. But looking at an analysis of the data showed that the legacy PFAS mixtures were associated with alterations in lipid and amino acid metabolism, and also many other pathways were affected in carbohydrate metabolism, vitamins, for example, and hormones. Next slide. And there's repeated data, or I should say lots of different data, showing that PFAS alter blood lipid patterns. That was seen very recently from analysis of the sister study data, but also here we're seeing that part of this is related to epigenetic changes, which involve DNA methylation, and there's an increase in the low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, the LDL-C. I'm going to show you some more data on that. Can I have the next slide? So this is just looking at the lipid trajectories in middle-aged women, and what you can see here is that the total cholesterol appears to be increased in most cases, but if you look at the LDL, that is a very strong association, especially with the PFOS and those compounds as well. I should mention that, let's see, the PFHSS you can also see is associated. No effect really on the HDL cholesterol or triglycerides, so it appears to be driven by the bad cholesterol. Next slide. And then I think this is a very interesting one. There are a number of studies that have been looking at the quality of follicular fluid and other reproductive patterns and embryo quality in people undergoing IVF. And what you see is the more PFAS you have in the fluid, the lower the quality of the embryos. So kind of concerning. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to realize, like with so many things, males and females often respond differently. So if we look at sex hormone responses, we can see that the higher blood PFAS are associated, for example, with changes in hormones. So kisspeptin is a mediator that is involved in GnRH production and LH production, and that increases in both sexes. We're seeing an association with PFAS that the sex hormone binding globulin It increases in males and decreases in females, which may impact the distribution of hormones. We also see in males that FSH, total testosterone, and E2 all decrease, while you see the opposite in females. Next slide. And this is, I mentioned to you, the very recent or relatively recent data coming out in thyroid cancer risk. And I should mention there's also quite a number of papers showing an increased risk of liver cancer. But anyhow, if you look at this, you can see again the significant increased risk with PFHXS, PFHPS, that's a C7. And then if you look at PFOS, its different forms, and PFNA, we're not seeing the statistical in this with thyroid cancer with PFOA. We go to the next slide. So how do we have all these effects? And there are multiple things that are involved. First of all, PPARs is a family of nuclear receptors, but it's initially a lot of the focus was on one specific nuclear receptor, but now we know there are multiple receptors involved: the androgen receptor, the estrogen receptor, the constitutive androgen receptor, PFR and FXR, and so on. PFAS also inhibit fatty acid transport, and they can interfere with mitochondrial function. So lots of ways that you can have toxicity. And if we look at the next slide, this one I think, is an important one just to look at it. What you see is that PFAS, I mentioned to you its impact on thyroid hormones, and we know that higher PFAS are associated with lower thyroid hormones and elevated TSH, which of course goes along with problems having enough, because your T4 has gone down. But anyhow, if you look at this, what you can see that a bunch of different receptors can be disrupted by, and this was looking at a whole bunch of different PFAS. And what you see is, for example, the androgen receptor, estrogen receptor alpha, ER beta, the mineralocorticoid receptor are all impacted. The PPARs, the PPAR alpha, beta, and gamma, actually, which are the ones that a lot of effort has been spent on, may not be impacted as much as by all the PFAS as some of the others are as well. But I think the point that I want to make is that the reason we have so many different health effects that are being associated with PFAS is because they mess up so many critical receptor systems in our bodies. Next slide, please. So this is looking at some of the disease pathways that have been associated with PFAS, and this is based upon looking at a transcriptomic approach, which is we look at an epigenomic approach, looking at changes in gene expression and some of the pathways that are being affected, things like anorexia, asthma, multiple kinds of cancers, some genetic instability, lupus, which is an autoimmune condition, stomach conditions, and so on. And there are a number of other pathways that have been shown associated. I just wanted, again, to make the point that we're not looking for one chemical or even one class of chemicals causing one effect. We should be looking for multiple adverse impacts. Next slide. So how does PFAS cause cancer? Again, multiple ways, but we know that PFAS can they lead to changes in gene expression and epigenetic changes, which of course epigenetics is what controls gene expression. And then these are associated with inflammation, cell signaling, endocrine disruption, and altered metabolism. This can lead to carcinogenesis. And if we go to the next slide, this is just bringing you back to all the health effects of PFAS exposure on multiple organ systems. What I haven't shown you here at all is some, for example, the delayed mammary gland development. That's been shown not only in experimental animal models, but we also know that women with higher levels of PFAS tend to nurse for shorter durations, which may be because their mammary glands haven't developed as well. And I'm not showing you here some of the stuff on, for example, there have been some data on bones. Next slide, please. So what's happening kind of in the policy and the regulatory agenda? Well, just 2 years ago, the International Agency for Research in Cancer looked at the two, what we call legacy PFAS. These are the ones that were in highest concentration of use, um, and in us at the highest concentrations as well. And PFOA, which is the C8 carboxylic acid, is considered a class 1 carcinogen, and PFOS, which is the sulfonic acid, this one is considered a possible human carcinogen. Next slide, please. And so EPA has done extensive analysis of what I should say are all kind of the perfluoroalkyl acids from the PFNA is the C9 relative of PFOA, PFHXA is the C6 relative of PFOA. I should mention gobs of PFHA and PFBA being used in our environment today. The PFBS is the relative of PFOS. It's a C4. And they've tried to do all, and what you can see, the green bars are where there's clear data, often in people and animals. So, for example, for all the chemicals where it's been looked at, they found things on the thyroid. You can see the liver kind of lights up. If you go down to the bottom, you can see that EPA hasn't done cancer studies other than, or I shouldn't say EPA doesn't have access to cancer data. DuPont has done cancer studies on Gen X, PFOA, and PFOS in experimental animals, and the animal data is all positive. Next slide, please. So, in a year and a half ago, after having proposed it in March of 23, EPA actually promulgated regulations on 6 PFAS in drinking water. This was by the Office of Water of EPA, which regulates what's in our drinking water or what's in our groundwater. It does not regulate what's in, for example, our consumer products or in our pesticides, or clearly EPA doesn't regulate our drugs. And we have a number of drugs which are PFAS as well. But so in 2022, EPA had concluded that there was no safe level for PFOA and PFOS. That's what the maximum contaminant level goal is, that they said these are carcinogenic and there's no safe level. And the MCL is the maximum contaminant level, and this is based on technological, economic, and sociological considerations. And they set it at 4 parts per trillion, or 4 nanograms per liter. When we want to go to what levels are in people, if you take the level in drinking water and you multiply it by about 100, that'll put you in the range of what's often found in blood. So PFOA and PFOS, they set levels of 4 parts per trillion. For PFHXS, PFNA, and Gen X, they said that the MCL for those was 10 parts per trillion. And then they said they did something that was very novel for the Office of Water, but it has been used for years in the Superfund program, is they said, we're going to look at the mixture of these chemicals. And if the hazard index is greater than 1, then that exceeds the MCL. And they initially gave all your water utilities 3 years to do monitoring, and then another 2 years to implement solutions. Just after the regulations were promulgating from the Office of Water, the Superfund office designated PFOA and PFOS as hazardous chemicals. And I should say, let's see, there are some other federal regulations on PFAS as well. The FDA has removed PFAS from food packaging. The Department of Defense has said no PFAS in AFFF by the end of 2024, although as of yesterday, there are bills both in the House and the Senate to give the Department of Defense 2 more years to achieve that. And the FAA said that you didn't have to use PFAS in domestic airports since 3 years ago. But then if we go to the next slide, this is kind of the bad news. A couple months ago, the administrator for EPA decided that he would extend the time for the water systems to implement solutions from 5 years to 7 years, and that they were withdrawing the MCLs that had been set for PFHXS, PFNA, Gen X, and PFBS, and they were going to relook at that data. And at the moment, they are revising the regulations Superfund as well. Next slide. So what about our states? Thank you, states. Weren't for our states, we would have a lot more problems, but lots of states are actually have regulations in water. So for example, Massachusetts, Maine, and Rhode Island set a MCL based upon the sum of 6 PFAS. Vermont used 5. Some other states also had MCLs that they're enforcing. Some of the states have MCLs that are more restrictive than the proposed EPA guides. Many states are looking at more than just PFOA and PFOS, which is good. And then there are regulations in many states banning or restricting AFFF containing PFAS. Many states actually have implemented or have in progress bans on food contact material containing PFAS. And many states, especially led by California and New York, are banning the use of PFAS in textiles and furnishings. Go to the next slide, which is just a nice map that just came out from Safer States, talking about the states that are planning to take more action on PFAS in 2025. And if you look at it, it's kind of interesting. Yes, it's a lot of our blue states, not totally, but we also have a number of our red states which are concerned about the PFAS problem as well. Next slide. So what do we know about clinical follow-up? The National Academy of Science and Medicine convened an expert group in 2021 and 2022 and concluded that there was sufficient evidence for a decreased antibody response in adults and children. And I should say this has been supported since then in multiple new studies about dyslipidemia in adults and children, decreased infant and fetal growth, and an increased risk of kidney cancer. And they believed in this point in time that the evidence was limited, but there was some data. And you know, I should have said it to begin with, everything that we're seeing in people, there are parallels in our experimental animal models. And in many cases, we have in vitro data that also supports it. So the liver enzyme alterations, and there's more data now supporting problems with, for example, increases in ALT and AST and so on. There's increased risk of pregnancy-induced hypertension, increased risk of testicular cancer. There are a couple of studies that have come out there as well. Increase in thyroid disease, and the increased risk of ulcerative colitis. Next slide. And so they made certain recommendations, which ATSDR, which is affiliated with CDC, finally issued guidance a year and a half ago, that if the PFAS blood concentrations, and I should almost put a little hold here and tell you, CDC only measures in the blood 16 PFAS, and these numbers are really based on 7 PFAS, and we know there are many others as well. So if the PFAS concentrations were below 2 parts per billion, they didn't expect that there'd be adverse health effects. If it were between 2 and 20, what they're suggesting is try to reduce exposure and prioritize screening for dyslipidemia, hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, and breast cancer. And if the PFAS blood is above 20 parts per billion, you would do what you do for between 2 and 20, and you'll really start looking for signs of kidney and testicular cancer and ulcerative colitis. Next slide, please. So, how do you get your patients tested for PFAS? It's available, but with limitations. Um, there are a number of US laboratories. Quest Diagnostics is one. Another one is Eurofins that can do the tests. It's about $350. Well, the Quest is about $350 for 9 PFAS. Eurofins, for a similar price, will give you many more PFAS, actually. The cost is usually borne by the patients. Some states have worked out ways that insurance will pay for it, but there's not a lot of consensus and guidelines. Um, I talked about the NASEM's stratified response. I think what's being recommended is use existing standard of care and promote mitigation measures. Um, and I think reducing exposures. And if people have elevated levels, you probably want to test again after 1 to 2 years to see if your attempts to reduce it have had any impact. Next slide, please. So how do you avoid PFAS? Well, again, I think we all know much better when policy controls it. You're asking for people to have change their personal behavior. So cut back on fast food and greasy carry-out food. Avoid most freshwater fish, and I hate making that recommendation. Um, you want to pop popcorn the old-fashioned way with an air popper on the stove. Microwave popcorn is loaded. The linings of those bags have loads of PFAS. And try to store your food in glass or stainless steel containers rather than plastics, because PFAS are present in many, many plastics. For consumer products, look for personal care products that don't have PTFE or fluoro ingredients. Be wary of all fabrics, later stain or water repellent. Avoid Teflon kind of nonstick pans and kitchen utensils, and avoid water-resistant cosmetics. You can install a certified filtration water system. There are a couple things that do a pretty good job. Granular activated charcoal, which is present in many of your refrigerators, as long as you keep changing the filter, works fairly well. And don't use sludge-based fertilizers or pesticides that are PFAS. And there are a lot of pesticides that are PFAS for gardening. I think that's something that we can try to do. Next slide. So I've talked about how persistent these chemicals are, but I haven't really given you any of the numbers. But you can see there's a range, obviously, depending upon the population and so on. And it's important to know that women tend to have shorter half-lives, and that's partially because of menstruation and lactation. Um, uh, Younger people, because kind of the half-life, what's in your blood gets a little by growth, gets diluted. PFAS are associated with decreased kidney function, and people with better kidney function have shorter half-lives, and gut inflammation is associated with shorter half-life. But you can see that if you look at the half-lives of things for some of the legacy ones like PFOA and PFOS, the half-life for PFOA, we often use an average half-life of about 3 years. For PFOS, we often use 5 years. PFHXS is longer than both PFOA and PFOS, and we often use 9 to 10 years for that one. The shorter chains, for example, PFBA has a half-life of only a couple days, but PFBS, which is the C4-sulfonic, has a half-life of at least 1 month. And if you think of many of the drugs that you use, that would be considered a very long-lived drug. Next slide. So is there anything an individual can do to lower their amount of PFAS or help get rid of it? And there is some new data coming out indicating that cholestyramine, which has been used rather than, for example, statins to help reduce cholesterol, can reduce at least some of your PFAS. And there's some data. There was a suggestion of this in the C8 study that there were a number of participants that there are 67,000 people in that study, but there were a small number of participants who took cholestyramine, and they tended to have lower levels than others. And if you go to the next slide, there's data showing that treating people with an anion exchange resin, for example, helped gets rid of some of these chemicals. But most people don't like to take some of these things for any length of time. But there's a lot of work going on in this area, trying to find, is there a way that we can actually assist the excretion? Of course, I mentioned that PFAS are eliminated through lactation. And now this way, but what do you do with the, then you have contaminants getting into our sewer, which is a major problem. Wastewater systems, often there's high levels of PFAS coming out of our wastewater treatment plants. Okay, next slide. So how are we going to manage this? I've told you that there are 15,000 or more PFAS. There may only be, at this point in time, about 600 that are intentionally made, but there are all the others that exist as well. The EU actually came out 5 years ago with an amazing strategy for a chemical for toxic-free future, and they pulled out PFAS at that point in time, and they said that you got to stop using it where you don't need it, like in firefighting foams. They said we've got to look at a group approach. We've got to look at this on a global scale. And they actually, in 2023, proposed a ban on all non-essential, non-intentional uses of PFAS. I should say that as of about a week ago, that has been weakened a little, where they've identified 8 categories of use, which they are allowing to continue at least for a while. And I published a paper about 5 years ago where we said, let's look at PFAS as a class because they are all persistent, they are all mobile, most of them are cumulative, and everyone that's been tested, which is a small subset of the 15,000, but have all been shown to be toxic. So next slide. So thanks a lot, and I hope we have a few minutes for some questions.